Perfect. Thank you for that, Ash. Well, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today on the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator and Industry Insights. This webinar is specifically for service providers in the dairy industry to provide support for the increasing need to understand emissions as we move closer to 2030 and 2050. My name is Robin McLean and I'm based in Gippsland, and I form part of the Carbon Farming Outreach Program. And with me today is Scott Jardine in Western Victoria and Heidi Barnier up in Northern New South Wales. So as part of this project, all three of us run workshops throughout Australia. So Heidi looks after Northern New South Wales and Queensland and also WA. Scott looks after Western Victoria, the Murray region and South Australia, and I look after Gippsland and Tasmania. During our webinar today, we will be covering the drivers of greenhouse gas emissions in dairy farms, international industry and supply chain targets, reporting requirements, how to calculate a carbon footprint using the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, attitudes towards carbon farming activities, reduction strategies, and we'll also have a couple of opportunities for Q&A as well. So we have 2 dedicated time slots for questions. So the first one will be halfway through the webinar today, and then our final one will be at the end of the webinar. So I'd just like to run through a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. During the webinar, please stay on mute. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to add them into the chat, and I'll read these out when we stop for questions. Also, as I mentioned, we have 2 dedicated time slots for questions. When we break for questions, you're also welcome to raise your hand, come off mute, and ask your questions then as well. Our webinar will run for approximately 2 hours, and we'll also have a short Menti poll partway through the webinar. So let's dive in. I'd just like to start with an acknowledgement of country before we kick off. I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been the stewards and custodians of country for over 60,000 years and have a strong and continuing cultural connections to lands and waters. As I mentioned in our introductions, Heidi, Scott and myself form part of the Understanding of the Carbon Farming Outreach Program, and that is funded by the Australian Government. So the funding towards our workshops and our one-on-ones and farm days all comes from the government. So I'd just like to acknowledge that funding before we start. So the carbon farming cycle. So our Understanding Farm Carbon workshops aim to increase dairy farmers' understanding of the role of greenhouse gas emissions in driving climate change. It also looks at emission sources and greenhouse gases relevant to dairy farms. We also look at international, national, industry and processor emissions reduction commitments, what they are and why they're necessary. We look at absolute emissions and emissions intensity and the link between the efficient, profitable production and low emissions. The Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator is also a big focus, and we look at how to collect data, enter data into the calculator, and using the calculator to inform farm decisions as well. We also cover activities which help to profitably reduce on-farm emissions as well, and the role of the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme as well in supporting emissions reduction and farm business operations. So this is the cycle that we cover. So we cover most of these points in our workshops. Sorry about that. Yes, and we also provide support for farmers as well that attend the workshops in the form of one-on-ones to help complete the carbon calculator and just deep dive in how to use it as well, and particularly around that data piece and the important data to consider throughout the year that will be necessary to enter into the calculator.
Awesome. Thanks, Robin. So if we take a look now at the kicking off our content and the greenhouse gas emissions breakdown for dairy, we have three main gases. So we have methane, which makes up 67% of on-farm emissions for dairy, and it's produced from things like ruminants, so enteric methane production in the rumen of livestock, and the waste management, so the management of the manure and its production of methane. We have carbon dioxide, which makes up 20% of dairy farm emissions, and this is coming from sources like energy and urea application, as well as the production of fertilizers. We have nitrous oxide, which makes up 13% of our on-farm emissions, and this is coming from sources such as nitrogen-based fertilizers, animal waste through urine and dung, and legumes as well. And just important to note that methane is 27 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of heating the earth, and nitrous oxide is 265 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of heating the earth as well. So if we take a look at absolute emissions and emissions intensity, it's important to understand these two terms because they're both provided in the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator output, but they're also important in terms of understanding the context of commitments and emissions reduction targets. So absolute emissions are the total emissions from a business, and this is reported as the volume of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is the total size of the footprint of that business. Emissions intensity is the emissions per unit of production. So for dairy, this is kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. And most milk emissions intensities use an equation to standardise milk production based on fat and protein content. And the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator standardises milk production based on 4% fat and 3.3% protein. Emissions intensities are good because it enables the comparison of farms' greenhouse gas emissions with other farms within the region, other regions of Australia, or even globally. And it's particularly relevant to our supply chain for reporting purposes and important for milk processors as well. So if we take a look at the slide, we have the image of a small farm, or an example of a small farm. So this farm has 88 cows. It produces 600,000 litres of milk a year, and it has an absolute emissions of 600 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. When that's brought down to emissions intensity, so emissions per unit of product, we get 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. If we then take a look at a large farm with 886 cows, 6 million litres of milk produced per year, and an absolute emissions of 6,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, we then look at our emissions intensity for that farm, and it comes to 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. So this shows you that these two farms vary in size in milk production and their absolute emissions, but when it's brought down to emissions per unit of product for emissions intensity, they're the same and equally efficient. So here's just an example to reiterate: greenhouse gas emissions minus our carbon stored long-term in things like trees and soil gives us our absolute emissions. Then if we take that absolute emissions and divide it by the kilogram of product, we get our emissions intensity. If we decrease our greenhouse gas emissions and we increase our carbon storage, or we do or both, we get a reduced footprint. If we decrease our greenhouse gas emissions or increase our carbon storage or both and increase our production, we get a reduced emissions intensity. So you may have heard of the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change, and it was adopted by 196 parties at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in France in 2015. And it was decided that we needed to peak emissions as soon as possible and aim for net zero by 2050. And in Glasgow at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in 2021, interim targets were introduced for emissions reduction by 2030 and not just 2050. As a member, Australia has committed to reduce its emissions, and Australia has agreed to reduction targets of a 43% reduction in emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So if we take a look now at the industry level action, the dairy industry has been on an emissions reduction pathway since 2015, and the Australian Dairy Sustainability Framework has a commitment of a 30% reduction in emissions intensity by 2030. So that's focusing on that emissions per unit of product. And there's also a commitment of net zero by 2050. There are a range of tools and resources that are already in place to support this, and farmers can actually take a range of activities already to improve their efficiency, with more options anticipated to become available and more cost effective as we move towards 2030. And by 2030, it's anticipated that dairy farmers will know their carbon footprint and be taking actions to reduce their emissions. So most companies or corporations have their own commitments for decarbonisation, and a handful of these companies include some of the Australian milk processors. Of the 100 largest economies, 69 are companies and 31 are countries. So it's important to note that government policy may now be less influential than the actual market forces. A lot of these targets align with the Paris Agreement of net zero by 2050. And some companies have committed to the Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, endorsed or approved pathways. And the SBTI initiative represents a shift from government setting the pathway to corporations or private entities doing so. And the SBTI pathways have a focus on reduction and insetting to achieve net zero. So if we take a look now at the schematic breakdown of emissions from the perspective of a dairy processor, we have scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So scope 1 is the direct activity related emissions, and scope 2 is the electricity used in direct activities. So if we take a look at the slide, we can see that scope 1 and 2 is during production of dairy products. So we have energy used in production facilities and transportation, making up 5% of total emissions approximately. We have scope 3 downstream, which focuses on transportation, the sale of products in food and in food service and retail, and then the consumption, cooling and cooking. So that makes up 10 to 15% of total emissions for a dairy processor. Then if we look at scope 3 upstream, we have farms and farm inputs. We have transportation, and then we have production of other ingredients and materials. And this is making up 80 to 85% of total emissions for a dairy processor. So there's mandatory climate-related financial disclosures that were introduced in 2024, and this is where entities need to produce sustainability reports, and it's phased in over 3 years. It impacts large entities that fit into 2 of the 3 criteria of consolidated revenue, gross assets, and full-time equivalent employees. It impacts registered asset owners with greater than or equal to $5 billion in assets under management, and also impacts National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme reporters. Group 1 commenced recording in January 2025 for reporting in 2026, and company directors are implicated in any report. These reports include scope 3 emissions from the second report, and as we've seen, farmers make up some companies' scope 3 emissions, therefore they may be asked for their emissions based on this. But processors cannot compel farmers to report for scope 3 as part of this mandatory reporting. So here we have some companies. Scott, can you just click so that the circles pop up for us, please?
Okay.
Thank you. So the circles in yellow represent the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme reporters, and they'll be included in group 1 of this phasing that we've just spoken about. The blue circles are other companies likely to be included in group 1 phasing of the reporting, but other entities may need to be ready to report as well. If we take a look now at the Australian greenhouse gas inventory, we can see that agriculture makes up 17% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And of that, dairy is 19% and dairy is 3% of Australia's emissions. So although we aren't a huge contributor, with electricity and transport rapidly converting to renewables, we will start to stick out or increase if we don't keep taking action to reduce our emissions, while the other industries are decreasing their emissions.
Thanks, Heidi. So we're just going to have a quick break for any questions that people may have. And Peter Gaffey has popped a question in the chat. So Scott, did you want to elaborate on your answer a little bit? So Peter asked, and this was in regards to the mandatory reporting slide, a couple of slides back. And he asked if it includes food waste. Did you want to elaborate on that, Scott?
Yeah, sure thing. So yeah, definitely where there's emissions that are coming from that food waste, the emissions are going to be reportable through the mandatory climate reporting. In terms of other aspects, so a lot of the focus in the sustainability space at this stage is to do specifically with climate. So essentially with traditional sustainability reporting, we would still have some of those aspects covered, like the efforts to minimize food waste. But they won't form a part of the mandatory component of the sustainability reports. At this stage, the only parts of that mandatory reporting will be to do with things like the Scope 3 or the direct impact of climate on the businesses' operations, both risks and opportunities.
Thanks for that, Scott. Steve Aldridge has popped a question into the chat, and I'm not sure if you would like to answer this, Heidi, or whether you would like to answer it, Scott. But he's asked, could you please repeat the statement regarding processes cannot make farmers report Scope 3 emissions?
Yep, that's fine, Robin. So processes, the statement is processes cannot compel farmers to report for Scope 3 as part of this mandatory reporting. So what we're saying there is that if the companies need to report, they cannot force the farmer to provide information to them for that reporting. They can incentivize it, but they can't make the farmer provide that information, but they can ask for it, obviously.
Just to expand on that, so there is an allowance in the legislation that provides an opportunity for businesses to use realistic estimates of those Scope 3 emissions, whether that's through estimates through things like the modelling through the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, or whether it's using industry-based whole of industry emissions intensity estimates.
Thanks, Scott. Does anyone have any questions? Would you like to come off mute and ask any questions? Of course, you're welcome to add them into the chat too. No, not a problem. Okay, well, we might continue on then. Okay, so I guess, sort of a key part of today's session is talking around this concept of carbon farming. So realistically, carbon farming is any of those agricultural or land management activities that do help to mitigate climate change. As we saw earlier with reducing our carbon footprint, these largely sit around that space of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions or increasing our carbon storage. When we're looking at our carbon footprint, it's really important to note that the footprint is calculated annually, and so both the emissions and the sequestrations relate to that annual footprint. Similarly, it can be looked at for the lifetime of a product, but yeah, generally what we're looking at is having that footprint represented as both the emissions and the storage over the same time frames. Now, when we're looking at carbon farming activities, we look at finding benefits for production, for animal welfare, profitability, efficiency, sustainability, and really key is social license as well. Now, what we're going to be doing is having a quick Menti poll.
Now, I'm hoping that everyone's familiar with Menti, but if you're happy to either use your phone, you can scan the QR code. Sorry, my mouse is here. So you can scan the QR code on the screen. Should be able to click on the join link at the top of the screen. Or if you're entering into your browser, go into www.menti.com and enter the code here, 59966385. So the question will be asking, what do you think are the main carbon farming activities or technologies dairy farmers might consider? Just give everyone a couple of minutes to enter into this. Fantastic. And so what we're seeing, a lot of, I guess, a lot of that focus around trees and solar, that increase in production as well is really key. And really good to see that we are having that focus on both sort of the productivity side of things and some of those drawdown aspects as well. Responses starting to slow down. So looking at some of those other aspects, so things like the tree planting, the genetics does play a really key role. That efficiency around our fertilizer use, and a fair few of those areas where we are seeing those themes around trees. But really good to see that. I guess things like our shelter belt side of things is where those trees can actually play a really key role, not just in sequestering the carbon, but also playing a really key role in supporting animal well-being and increasing productivity. Fantastic. So I guess one of the things that we do see when we're looking at our emissions from, and as we're seeing all of these different aspects, we can see sort of they sit in 6 key areas around our energy and fuel use, our fertilizer use, effluent management, livestock, trees and soil. Now, across those 6 groups, what we're looking at is sort of the breakdown of the contribution that those make to the emissions, and I guess the key focuses. So really key here, when we're looking at our energy and fuel, that solar aspect, or looking at renewable energies, for a dairy farm, quite often, while it gets a lot of focus, they're really contributing a small proportion of the overall emissions. The livestock component, because of that enteric methane, while it is really key for our production systems to have those livestock, they do contribute a fair portion of our overall emissions, so sitting at 62%. So I guess one of the things that we do sort of try to focus on, especially where we're looking at that return on investment, is being able to identify the areas that are going to be both cost effective, but also that are going to have a substantial impact on our overall emissions. Excuse me. As you'll note here, we don't have set figures for trees and soil sequestration for an average dairy farm, because that can really vary quite considerably. Now, something that we have been looking at is really trying to break down a range of those emissions reduction activities. And I guess a lot of these things are sort of the ideas that were coming up in the Menti poll. And really we can break them down into three key sort of aspects. Those activities that are available now and cost effective, so they're either hitting cost neutral or hitting a return on investment above the investment cost. There are other activities that are available now, but that we see can deliver increased return on investment, with whether it's increased scaling or whether it is just improvements in technology. And then those aspects that are that have future potential, whether that's requiring a level of scalability to be able to see those costs come down, or potentially improvements in technology. So things like treating the calves to reduce methane production, the carbon neutral fertilizer. Some of those aspects are still not yet at a point where they're cost effective, and then naturally things like the methane reducing and inhibiting vaccines in development, but not yet available. Excuse me. Now, one key thing to note here is that Dairy Australia has developed what's called a marginal abatement cost curve, or MAC for short, which is an acronym that we'll thankfully never have to use again, but essentially have 6 fact sheets available on the Dairy Australia website, which looks into a range of these actions that can be taken and breaks them down into some of the ideas that can be utilised and achieved, the connections through to the research, and what can be expected and achieved with utilisation of these different activities. Now, when we are working with dairy farmers, we like to try and focus on sort of the 3 key pillars of prioritising our reduction activities, and wanting to find that sort of sweet spot where we are able to achieve environmental sustainability, profitability, because if it's going to cost too much to be able to actually do it, then it's going to be really hard to achieve. But even more important than, I guess, than the profitability and sustainability is that efficiency aspect. And I guess one of the really key things to think about there is if you've got something that you're having to do as part of your new business operation and it pisses you off no end, it's not going to last very long. So being able to find that priority where we can find activities that we can see that it can at least be cost neutral, that it is ticking that box in terms of it's not doing environmental harm, remembering that social license is really key to a lot of our considerations, and then making sure that we can see ourselves actually doing this action ongoing. Excuse me.
Thanks, Scott. So, very important question. Where do I start? The best place to start is through the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator or Dairy Base. So a lot of farmers do already use Dairy Base. These are both found in the climate and environment section on the Dairy Australia website. And essentially so the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, you click on that and it's an Excel spreadsheet which you download onto your computer. So some of you have probably already seen this picture. It always gets a few laughs at workshops. Essentially, the importance of this picture, which was taken at the Allen Bank Research Farm in Gippsland, it's there to demonstrate that we model rather than measure on farm emissions. And this is consistent across global markets as well. So measuring is expensive and intensive. We couldn't possibly put all of these on every single cow in Australia. It's just not practical or we're just not able to do that either. So the point of this is to say that, you know, we model rather than measure. So the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator modelling has decades of science and maths behind it to result in your carbon footprint. It is also maintained and updated regularly to align with the international reporting standards as well. So when you download the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, this is what it looks like. It's a spreadsheet, and you'll see that you've got some important information there, like your farm details as well. But the main things it covers is your livestock, milk, diet, fertilizer, energy, manure. And there is also a section on there to report any trees that you might have growing on your farm through re-veg or riparian areas, or even agroforestry. And if you're measuring soil carbon, or if your farmers are measuring soil carbon, that can also be included in that section as well. It is also important too, when you open it up, you'll see that there's already some information in there. That is an example farm, just to provide a bit of context on the sort of information that an average farm might have. So it is important, as you can see there up on the top right-hand corner, to clear the input cells before you start, or your farmer starts as well. So this is what Dairy Base looks like as well. Some of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with Dairy Base. If your farmers are already using Dairy Base, you can actually download the information that's recorded in there. So you'll see that circle there, download spreadsheet. So you're able to download that and input that directly into the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator as well. With our next slide, I won't go into detail because Heidi has already covered that really well already, but the main thing to highlight here is the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator. It will provide a figure for your absolute emissions on farm, so the total emissions from a business reported as the volume of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's the total size of the footprint for that business. It also provides a number for the emissions intensity. So this is the emissions per unit of production. So for dairy, it's kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. So we're just going to look at the data collection sheet that is also there. So when you go to that climate environment space and you click on the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator button, you'll come up with a number of cells below that you can click on, and one of those is the data collection sheet. So this is a snippet of the livestock data section. So it provides a bit of context for the information that's important to record throughout the year when you're reporting on your annual emissions. So you'll have things there such as, you know, the number of animals, so your milking cows, your heifer replacements, any bulls or other stock that you may have. You also look at their average live weight too. Now, because this, as Scott mentioned before, majority of our emissions come from enteric methane, which is from the cows predominantly. So it is really, really important to get this information as accurate as you possibly can. Now, I understand not all farmers are going to have scales on their farm, but moving forward, if that is an area they may want to look at, if they want to make sure that their weights are as accurate as possible, is getting scales on the farm too. You also look at things like daily weight, live weight gain as well, any cows you've sold, and their average live weight when they're sold as well.
Thanks, Robin. So We'll have a look at a live example of the data entry sheet. So as Robin was saying, we do have that aspect up the top where we're looking at the farmer details. Makes it so that we can keep track of what year we're actually looking at, and setting the state, both in terms of our overall state, but also selecting our region. And this provides an opportunity to have those comparisons, as well as our state-based areas. We can set comparisons against feeding systems. So we can say that, oh, this is a low grain feeding system or a high grain TMR farm. Now, when we're working with the farmers, because we recognise that a lot of the time the data might be that we're taking from the collection sheet might need a bit of adjustment, or potentially there could be areas for improvement. What we can do is, and we'll use comments within Cell to be able to provide some of those suggestions, whether it's recommendations for improvement in future data management or explanations as to how we've calculated some of the data. So for this aspect, when I was working with the farm that this data's come from, we recognised that the live weight entered for the milking herd was actually the same as the live weight at point of sale. Now, what we expect to see when that milking herd is starting to dry off, those cows that are becoming cull cows, they'll keep producing a bit of milk. And they'll definitely keep eating as much as they were getting fed when they're at their peak production, but they're probably going to be dropping off, so putting on a bit of weight before we notice that they're ready to dry off and removed from the farm. So anticipate that the actual live weight that we should be seeing in that milking herd should be a bit lower than that point of sale live weight. Similarly, I've got another question over here where I've asked questioned the weight of the bulls, being able to see, because we're not seeing any of those bulls turning over, they're hanging on to them, and questioning whether it might be a little bit of an overestimate of the live weight of the bulls. So this is something for them to approve in their future data management.
Thanks, Scott. So if we now take a look at the milk production and the diet section of the data collection sheet that relates back to the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, we focus on milk production to start. We can enter in milk production based on whether the farm uses litres or kilograms of milk solids per annum, as well as the average annual fat percentage, protein percentage, and the average lactation length in days. And the calculator will then estimate daily milk production based on cow numbers, the total milk production, and the average lactation length. So you can then cross-check this to see if these match up with any livestock numbers that might seem to be looking odd or that could be missing. The calculator needs to know all the milk that's being produced so that it can accurately estimate energy intake requirements and emissions produced. So this means that we need to enter in the total milk that's being produced on the farm, which could be more than the milk that the farm's actually being paid for. So if perhaps the farmer has dumped a vat due to a power outage during the year, or they've fed some milk from the vat to the calves, then this will all need to be included in the total milk production to be added onto the end of year milk statement potentially as well. So you just need to capture that total milk production as it was on the farm for the year. For diet, the milker's diet, it's required to add in dry matter intake, dry matter digestibility, and the crude protein for all feeds, including silage, hay, pasture, and any supplements as well. If you do not have figures for all of these, there are some appendices and averages within the help tabs of the calculator that can be used to help you calculate the feed intake. And the calculator also estimates the diet intake based on average milk production and diet dry matter digestibility. So it provides an opportunity to cross-check this again. And you can also subtract the difference between the supplementary feed and the total estimated intake if you don't have pasture intake information available, but the farm is feeding pasture. Metabolizable energy can also be converted to dry matter digestibility if the farm has metabolizable energy information but doesn't have dry matter digestibility. And that equation is in the calculator in the help tabs to help you work that out as well. The important part here is the calculator needs the dry matter digestibility and the crude protein percentage to estimate emissions of nitrous oxide and methane. You can then include the feed data for all other stock classes as well at the bottom, which Scott will show you in a minute, for the dry matter digestibility and that crude protein percentage.
Thanks, Heidi. So as we saw, yeah, we've got the that opportunity to be able to select whether we're entering in as either litres per herd per annum or kilograms of milk solids. Now, we'll see in this cell, in meeting with the farmer, we did see that, yeah, they'd recorded their the volume of milk as the amount from their milk check, but through the meeting with the farmer, we saw that they were actually feeding an extra 4 litres per day to the rising heifers for the first 60 days of life. So great thing about working in the tool as a Excel spreadsheet is that we can use formulas. So up the top, you can see that I've entered in the original milk production figure plus an additional 4 litres per day for 60 days for the rising heifer numbers. And I've recorded again that as a comment on that cell. We do also have a comment. So originally they'd recorded almond hulls as their other feeds. Now, while it doesn't impact on anything in the data that's entered into the feed tab, as a note to remind us at a later date when we're looking at our scope 3 emissions, byproducts are calculated without including scope 3 emissions. So almond hulls being a byproduct, we didn't record them not in the other feed inputs tab, but in the byproducts cell. And as Heidi was saying about the other feed quality table aspects, so we do have this calculator for being able to enter in the ME, and that'll calculate out our estimated dry matter digestibility. And we've also got these options to be, if we've got multiple grains or multiple silage sources, we can enter all of those different aspects in, and it'll calculate out a single feed cell at the bottom. We do have those links to be able to go back to the original baseline farm data. So that link is over here, but you can also scroll along the bottom. There are just a lot of tabs to be able to work through.
So fertilizer, this is entered in as kilograms per hectare or tons of element. And it's important to not include any fertilizer that's been purchased, but if it hasn't been spread, do not include it. Sorry. So you may have purchased a bulk amount of fertilizer for the year, but you only include what has been spread for that year. You might be able to get a copy of the fertilizer that you've received from the fertilizer company as well, or the farmer can. And that's also a really handy tool to use when you're inputting this data into the tool, into the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator as well. Otherwise, there's also a list of common fertilizer types and percentages of elements in each blend, which is found in the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator appendix at the end as well.
So as we're scrolling down to that area, so yeah, as Robin said, we can either enter in as tons of element per year, or we can enter in as kilograms per hectare. So you'll see if we're entering in as kilograms per hectare, we've got the option to use those, the area of the farm that's being used either under pastures or under crops. That option's disabled when we move into applying tons of element per year. Excuse me. So as Robin was saying, when we've got the calculator or the data collection sheet, we can provide that aspect of being able to record just the tons of fertilizer, and then you'd naturally multiply that by the percentage. Now we do have that fertilizer rates tab. So this is pretty much the last tab on the whole of the spreadsheet, but we can enter in our tons applied for each of the standard fertilizer types, and can also create our own custom blends at the bottom. Excuse me. Not a lot of other additional comments there, but one thing to note is that when we're looking at our lime and dolomite application. So both lime and dolomite, when they neutralise the acidity in the soil, we do see that carbon dioxide released from that. We want to consider whether that's being applied and how that's being applied. So for this farm, they were acquiring new blocks, and those blocks have been fairly run down. So we're running on a fairly high lime application each year, and just made a note here to acknowledge that, yeah, look, we are looking at a higher lime application than usual. Now, one other aspect in the fertiliser rates area, any fertiliser that's not listed as urea goes into a percentage of nitrogen that's not urea. However, we do recognise that a lot of blends actually rely on urea for a portion of that that nitrogen source. So that note that I've made here, even though in the fertilizer rates tab, it was estimating that our nitrogen percentage from urea was 60%. What we see is that we've actually got 35% of the pasture booster is coming from nitrogen, and 60% of the custom blend was coming from urea for the nitrogen. So we do have just that slightly higher percentage.
So for our energy and fuel usage, we need to include the total purchased electricity that relates to the dairy business. So this should exclude any houses or anything not related to the business. If the electricity supplier guarantees a portion of the power is from renewables, you can include this too in the calculator as a percentage. For the fuel, you need to put in the fuel consumption for the farm, but it's also important to include any contractor fuel usage on your farm or on the farm that you're working with. So there's also some useful tips and estimates in the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator that will help you calculate a contractor's fuel usage on the farm based on the activities that have been undertaken on the farm if the actual fuel usage is unknown. Thanks, Scott.
So yes, probably the most straightforward bit, entering in the electricity use. Yep, you enter it in as they've recorded it on the sheet. Now that contractor diesel usage, as Heidi was saying, there is, and apologies, it's slightly small font, but a list of all of the different activities that could be used and that litres per hectare that would estimate the activity would be going through. There is an aspect to be able, so what I've done is just created a little bit of a calculator to add on to that to make it slightly easier for not having to enter all the data into one cell, but you can just enter that in either as an external calculator or just as a formula into that cell.
So we also include purchased feed or supplements as well. So we enter that in as tonnes and also the percentage fed to milkers as well. So that's just to record the Scope 3 emissions piece there. We also look at any carbon that's sequestered on the farm. So as I mentioned before, if farmers are measuring their soil carbon levels and they've got accurate records there, they can also include this in the sequestered trees area. So it's not specifically just for trees, but it must be formally measured if they want to record soil carbon that's being stored. Otherwise, if they have any trees that are aged between 1 to 25 years of age, all those are included here in the carbon sequestered in trees section as well. So they may have multiple areas of trees, that's fine. They can all be included as separate components in each of those sections there as well. Thank
you. So yeah, as Robin was saying, yeah, the entering the feed aspect, it's good to just double check whether they were recording that as delivered weights or as dry matter percentage, because we are looking for the dry matter tonnage in this entry area. But yeah, thankfully the farmer for this farm had already been recording everything as the dry matter rather than the tonnes as fed. That percentage distribution between the milking herd and other stock is important to see where we're apportioning each of those emissions, whether it's to milk production or to live weight meat production. When we're looking at that carbon sequestration space, we can, as Robin said, enter that data in with a drop down of either no estimate based on the data entered or carbon sequestered using other tools. Important to note that if you are entering based on carbon sequestered using other tools, we're entering it in as tonnes of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. And that, so to be a lot of the time, if we have a tool that's providing outputs for sequestration or for soil carbon levels, that'll report in the tonnes of carbon. So it's important to calculate back to tonnes of carbon dioxide rather than tonnes of carbon. To do that, what we do is multiply by 44 divided by 12. Entering in those tonnages again particularly with soil carbon side of things, but if we're entering in sequestration from other tools, it is important to note that we're only entering in the sequestration for that year. So if you've got a history of selecting soil carbon of sampling and monitoring soil carbon levels, we'd be subtracting that year's the total amount of soil carbon that we get in our tests from the previous year's existing soil carbon levels. When we are entering in the carbon sequestered using other tools, we do need to enter in the areas of the hectares that we're looking at still. For this tool, this entry, we just use that single tab. So we're saying 1 year age, 1 hectare of trees, and they're based in Southwest Vic, and they're a mixed species environmental planting.
So for the effluent and manure management, here's where you can enter in information on how the manure is managed on the farm. So for this section, you can enter the farm-specific data based on how the manure is managed to determine the greenhouse gas emissions from urine and dung deposits. And for many grazing or pasture-based farms, the state-based fractions will be relatively accurate here for cows off pasture for around 3 to 4 hours per day for milking. So you can select that in that scenario if that works. But for farms that have animals spending significant periods of time on concrete or housed or on feed pads, it's best to enter the information that's specific to the farm. And the main aim here is to capture where the manure effluent has the solids separated, because the more anaerobic the manure system, for example, in a pond or a lagoon, the more methane is being produced. So that's really what we're trying to capture in this section.
And again, so yes, as Heidi was saying, we can enter in and select from that drop down, but we just want to use those default state based factors and fractions. It is, if you do have accurate data on your effluent management, though, it's generally a good idea to be able to enter that, because there's so many different variations in the way effluent is managed on farm that being able to enter in a few extra details will provide with a more accurate and quite often a slightly lower emissions footprint. So we're selecting that user-defined fractions. Now, really key to note, when we're looking at the hours per day that we're spending on concrete, what we're wanting to look at is the midpoint cow for that. So if we're spending 3 hours per milking and we're milking twice a day, that could be 3 hours per day that they're spending on concrete, or it could be up to 6, depending on how they manage the herd afterwards. For this farm, they were sending the cattle from the dairy. They were able to wander back, but they were wandering to a feed pad where there was a different level of manure management. So we only want to see in this first section the manure that's going into the wet lagoons. So we're looking at it's saying that, okay, so the midpoint cow, she spent 3 hours per day, so that's 1.5 hours for each milking on concrete, and we've got 305 days of milking. Now we're looking at those percentages of solids that or waste that's not ending up in the lagoon. So potentially, if we were looking at a farm that had waste that's just draining straight out into the paddock next door, we'd enter into that next cell down. Or if that waste is ending up in a sump or a dispersal system and then flushed without any with or without any further treatment, potentially that could be going straight into an irrigation system and distributing out to strategic paddocks. Those two areas would be entering in. But if we don't have any data entered into those cells, it's assumed that 100% of the solids and liquids that are ending up on the concrete areas of the dairy platform are ending up in that pond and lagoon system. Now, with our solid separation, we can either enter in that we're separating those solids, and it's assumed that any solids that are separated are ending up in a composted type system where they're breaking down in a less anaerobic environment, and then we'd enter in the percentage of the waste that's going through that pre-treatment. And again, so we're looking at how long we're holding back and then holding back on a feed pad. For this farm, they had 60 days. The rest of the year, they were just wandering straight back to pasture and being able to select for scraped and stockpiled. We do have that range of options. So whether, again, it is flushed and going straight to the paddock, flushed and spread from a sump, flushed and going to the lagoon, or scraped and stockpiled for composting. Similarly, if we do have those heifers that are potentially, this could be when we're lead feeding and preparing for calving, and also training the heifers, running them through the dairy leading up to starting milking, we'd enter in any of those figures. For this farm, they weren't in a position to start lead feeding, but it is an opportunity for them to consider in future. Now, once we've entered all our data in, what we get is, so this is a slightly condensed version of the endpoint of data. We can see on the original, doesn't even fit on a screen, but you can see that all of our different emission types, scope 1, methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide from electricity, scope 3, pre-farm embedded, and that gets broken down into all of the different livestock classes, the fertilizer sources and things like that. But just for ease of access, I've hidden the middle sort of columns. So what we're looking at, we do get that breakdown of the gross emissions. So that's emissions before we reduce any carbon sequestration. So as we see, that 1 hectare of 1-year-old trees didn't even achieve 1 tonne of carbon dioxide sequestered. So we do see quite a variation in terms of the age of the trees, in terms of how much carbon will be getting sequestered per hectare per year. So it starts off quite low, peaks around sort of year 10 to 15, and then starts to fall away again. And this is one of those key aspects as to why we look at really focusing on recording the data for the trees that are between 1 and 25 years. It does taper off very gradually. So over time, we see sort of lower and lower annual carbon sequestrations. So if they're really keen to consider every tree on the farm, we can actually include trees that are remnant vegetation. Usually you look at entering them as 100 plus years. And we will get a very small amount of carbon sequestered in that area. But in terms of time and energy invested in being able to do those calculations, the return doesn't necessarily stack up. And then once we've got our emissions, we've got gross emissions, sequestration, and then net emissions, or the carbon footprint of the entire farm. In the last 2 columns, what we have is both your own farm. And so this one, the 0.96, what we're looking at is that kilograms of fat and protein of carbon dioxide per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. In the last column, we see the industry-based average. So we're comparing in this instance with the Western Victoria average for the financial year being considered. We do see on the second line But we've also got, as well as that kilograms per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk, we've also got a figure for kilograms of milk solids. So some international regions focus primarily on the kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of milk solids. Locally, we do tend to focus on the fat and protein corrected milk, but just so that we can compare with different markets, we've got both figures there. And then we've also got the kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of live weight gain. So for this farm, they had a very small number of cows being culled out. We had a lower level of, a higher level of carryover cows. They were working on really rapidly increasing their herd, so their culling rate was lower. They were carrying through cows where they weren't getting back in calf, and they were also really dropping away in terms of any of the calves that they were wanting to carry. So as a result, we see a much higher proportion for this farm in terms of the emissions that are allocated to milk compared to meat production, and the industry average there we see is a bit of a lower percentage allocated to milk, assuming that we quite often see in that region a higher proportion of calves being carried through. Now, for those that don't like looking at great big tables of lots of numbers, there is also a breakdown in terms of a bar graph where we can compare again against those figures. It's really important to note, as when we were looking at the emissions for the whole of Australia, which was broken down into percentages, this again is broken down into percentages rather than kilograms of emissions associated with each different area. But we can use that to be able to do a very quick check across to say, yep, actually we've got, as we were anticipating, with the regional average has a much lower percentage of the emissions coming from urea and lime. As we noted there, they are going a much higher percentage of, or a much higher proportion of the farm is getting limed on an annual basis at the moment because they're trying to recover those paddocks as they buy them. Excuse me. Now, when we look at both of those previous data recording aspects, they're a bit of a challenge and quite a big piece to be able to look at. So in the latest revision of the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, it also provides a one-page summary of the data that's and information for that particular farm. So what we see there is we do have our total emissions, our carbon sequestered, and our net emissions. Those carbon numbers as well, so the emissions intensity per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk, emissions intensity per kilogram of milk solids, and the emissions intensity associated with the milk produced, as well as that proportion. We do get a slightly more condensed as well donut graph to be able to see what proportions. And quite clearly we see, as with the industry averages, we see a lot of that emissions is coming from enteric methane. Okay, so quite a graph heavy section, but we'll just take a few minutes to look through this graph. So what we're looking at here is the proportion of, the production of both milk and greenhouse gas emissions since 2007 through to 2021. What we see as the broad trends here is we are seeing a overall decrease both in the emissions that are coming from farms, but also a decrease in milk production. So, yes, gross emissions are going to be dropping with milk production. We do see a bit of an improvement in the emissions intensity as we move through. So that's represented in terms of the difference in the two bars. So back in 2007, we were pushing quite a high emissions intensity. That has improved quite substantially until the 2020s. But really key to note is that a lot of these sort of the emissions intensity figure is quite strongly sort of linked to sort of the productivity improvements, and a lot of the aspects that we're seeing here, they're fairly well controlled already. Excuse me. Again, looking at the emissions intensity as it sort of stands at the moment. So the average emissions intensity across the whole of the dairy industry in 2023 was sitting at 0.93 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. In this chart, we see that so from all of the dairy farm monitor projects over the last 17 years, we see quite a broad distribution of those emissions intensities. We see quite a skewing towards well over 1.1. But we do also see that we have had farms that have been recording emissions intensities at or below 0.75 kilograms of fat and protein corrected milk. Now, when we're looking at this graph, sitting around that 1 kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk, that was where we were sitting at in 2015. So that was where we set our emissions reduction targets around our emissions intensity. So 0.75 is roughly where we're wanting to get to for that 30% reduction in emissions intensity by 2030. What we can see from this data is that using currently available technologies and activities, it is already achievable to achieve that lower emissions production. But there's a range of farms that will have a different level of work to be able to get to that sort of a space. Looking at regional aspects, so nationally, as I was saying, we're sitting at 0.93. Different states do have different levels of emissions intensity. Part of that comes back to the age of the farm, the sources of protein can often play quite a key role. So where we've got more homegrown and well-utilised protein, that can help to reduce that emissions intensity. Where there's transport required or more requirement for being able to store fodder for later utilisation, that can push those emissions intensity figures up a bit. Now, really key to note that where we're sitting at the moment, compared to the 80s, we've had a 23% decline in emissions intensity. But a lot of those efficiency gains were achieved early in the piece. So pre the 2010s, as we saw back in 2007, there were emissions intensities were sitting well over 1.1 per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. But as we've seen, we have seen a fairly consistent decline in that emissions intensity. But really key to note that with a lot of that shift in the sort of pre-2000s, a lot of the easy gains, the low-hanging fruit, had already been captured. So what we're looking at moving forward is a need to both stay on top of the existing efficiency gains while we work on trying to capture some of those additional aspects.
Thanks for that, Scott. So we just wanted to introduce some insights that we've found so far while we've been running our workshops. So one of the topics that we cover when we run the workshops is asking participants to think about what the carbon farming activities that they're already doing on farm or looking to implement soon. So that's highlighted in green. What are some carbon farming activities that might suit your farm? So this is in yellow on the graph. And what are the carbon farming activities that will not suit your farm or you wouldn't consider implementing on your farm? And those are in red. So this graph is in relation to the energy and fuel section that we cover. And as you can see with the green there, quite a lot of farms are already implementing solar and on-farm renewables. And if they haven't implemented it already, there's interest there to incorporate that into their business. There is a little bit of interest in terms of batteries as well, moving forward. Although interestingly, electronic vehicles, they haven't been super popular as well. A lot of the workshops we've seen, they're not really interested in buying electric vehicles. They don't see them useful. And quite often they might be too expensive to even consider as well. So this graph looks at trees and soils. in particular. So great thing to see here is a lot of farmers are already doing shelter belts or they're fencing off remnant bush areas. However, agroforestry has been receiving a little bit of red. So quite a few farmers don't feel like that's going to suit their business. So I'm not quite sure why that is, but that is an interesting outcome that we've been seeing. Many farms are already doing or considering pasture species selection as well in terms of, perennials, multi-species, those sort of things, stocking rates. Also, pest and plant and animal control as well is something that they're already managing very, very well and implementing. And also composting is something that's come up as a bit of interest as well with farmers too, which is great to see.
So if we take a look now at the livestock and feed carbon farming actions, many participants focused on efficient feed utilisation, balancing crude protein to energy, the use of sex semen, culling unproductive cows, as well as herd testing. There was a fair amount who didn't see value without support or incentive in feeding fats and oils for methane reduction or using vaccines to reduce methane. And there were also some people who were currently selecting for the high EBV genomic traits and some who didn't actually see value in doing it without support or incentive as well. So that was quite a mixed one that was there. Thanks, Scott. So we take a look now at the effluent and fertiliser carbon farming actions. There was a high level of participants using those 4 Rs. So the right source, the right rate, the right time and the right place for fertiliser use, as well as soil testing and the timely application of effluent. There was a mix of orange and red values, so those values representing intending to do them or would need that extra support or incentive to do towards the effluent testing. And it potentially poses that question, is this something that needs more awareness amongst some service providers for available services to farmers as well here? Interesting to note that there were participants that didn't see value in effluent additives to reduce methane unless supported or incentivised, but there were still a considerate number of participants who saw it as value and actually intended to consider it as well.
Thanks for that, Heidi. So questions. We do have some questions in the chat, so I'll run through those first. Well, Scott Barnett has actually put a statement in there saying that there are other methane mitigating feed additives currently available in Australia beyond those that were listed. So thanks for that, Scott. We'll need to investigate that and include those. Claire Alexander, I'm not sure if Scott or Heidi would like to answer this question, but one question I've been asked from a farm is if they do not raise any replacements on farm, all calves are sold, then replacements are purchased as milkers. Where is that captured and does that improve the farm's greenhouse gas emissions profile by not having those animals on farm for 2 years? So Heidi or Scott?
Yeah, I'm happy to pick that one up. So yeah. Naturally, anything that is coming in as a brought-in product, so and that includes purchased livestock, will carry those emissions associated with its upbringing. There are times where it can have a positive impact in terms of reducing the emissions intensity. If we have someone that's outsourcing the raising of those calves to a place where they can be done more efficiently and more productively to really focus just on the calf raising part of the business and achieve growth weight targets as rapidly as possible, then that's going to have an impact on the greenhouse gas emissions. Where it's just an outsourcing to different blocks, then yeah, potentially it won't have any real impact on the difference. What we do see is that through improvements in the tool and aspects like this, we will see more of that shift and focus to have the emissions associated with those purchased livestock It's not fully represented in the dairy carbon calculator at the moment, but yeah, where any aspect goes over contributing potentially 1% or more of the total emissions, that's where we see those triggers. So at this stage, that 1% rule has been applied, where it's such a small amount of emissions that are generally associated with that raising period that they're not necessarily factored in. But yeah, the calculator, if the need arises, will incorporate that aspect. But largely what we're looking at, because we're looking at the emissions for that period rather than the historic lifetime emissions for the livestock, whether they're raised on or off farm, they'll be represented, the emissions for that year, in the livestock numbers for their select group. So when they come back into the farm, if we haven't had those raising heifers, they'll be represented in the milking herd.
Thanks for that, Scott. Peter Gaffey had another question. He has had to jump off since he asked the question, but I think for the benefit of the group, we'll answer the question here as well, and we can get back in touch with Peter afterwards. But his question is, how important is it to keep notes on how you arrived at different numbers that are inputted? So he said here, my assumption is the calculator will get better as the science gets better. So in 10 to 15 years' time, we can ensure we're comparing apples with apples to measure how far we've come. So Scott or Heidi, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, I can address that. And if you guys, the team, wants to add anything, feel free. So as we do these carbon footprints, we find it's really important to keep notes on how we arrive at our calculations, because it helps. Will help the following years to see how we've worked the numbers, and it also will help if there ever comes the time when this project ends, especially this goes till March next year. So if the carbon footprint calculations need to then be passed on to someone else, they can see how those numbers have been calculated and how we've adapted that to suit the farm. So as was mentioned earlier in the webinar, the calculator is currently based on decades of science and maths, so there is plenty of science that's behind it. But as that potentially changes or anything's updated, then the calculator is regularly updated as well. So there's the potential for those changes, but that's why it's important to keep a record on how we have calculated as we've gone along through the years. Feel free to add anything, guys.
Yeah, I might just add, so yeah, where the calculator does get updated, a lot of those updates aren't in terms of improvements in the science or the understanding. Those updates generally reflect the changes to the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, which relies on figures from the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, IPCC. Every few years, they'll do an update of the emissions intensity figures that are applied to different greenhouse gases. And we see those flowing through first from IPCC to the NGGI, the Greenhouse Gas Inventory, and then from the NGGI, then we update the values. But that doesn't mean that the science has changed or the science is shifting. It just means that the impact of the different greenhouse gases in terms of whether it's the proportion of gases in the atmosphere can potentially impact on the overall impact of those gases in our calculations.
Kathy Ashby has also added to that there's a spot in the spreadsheet to record comments on how you arrived at certain figures. This is useful to keep your working all in one space for future reference as well. Yeah, that's a great comment. Thanks for that, Kathy. So Damien has asked here, how big was the sample size in those last few slides? So the insights from our workshops that we've run already. So we have, Scott, Heidi and myself have run a number of workshops nationally. So it is a reasonable pool of data so far. And it's a mix from New South Wales, Queensland, Western Victoria, Gippsland and Tasmania. We haven't run one in South Australia yet. So it is a significant sample size. I don't know if Scott or Heidi would like to add anything extra to that one.
Only I think that at this stage, we're up to 177 farmers that have attended workshops. Over the life of the project, we're looking at trying to get 650 or more farmers through workshops. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah. And thanks, Ash. Ash has popped that in the chat as well. Thank you for that. So Dan Cullen has asked the calculations / assumptions which underpin turning the spreadsheet inputs into numbers. Is this summarized and or based on reference standard? Would like to understand how it relates to other countries that are doing the international market expectations. So Scott or
I'm happy to take that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so all of the calculations that go into the ADCC and similarly into all of the other, so there are also GAF tools or greenhouse gas accounting formulas, which is the other main tools that are available in Australia and feed into a lot of the other tools available. But all of these tools rely on the IPCC's formulations for each of the different inputs. And so, yes, they are all available. It's in a fairly extensive and long form document. But those calculations are based on the inputs as well as the location geographically. So different countries will have slightly different formulas that are used based on things like the main sources of their inputs, whether they're, for instance, importing fertilizers from Russia or from Canada, will have different impact on the emissions associated with the urea source, for instance. But so that all of those tools do rely on those calculations and formulas as set and agreed by IPCC.
Thanks for that, Scott. So I've got another question here from Claire asking whether or not the slide deck can be made available. I'm sure that's okay. Is that okay, Ash, for it to be sent out?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that. Yeah, so we will follow up with the slide deck after our session today. Does anyone have any other questions that they would like to come off mute and ask or add into the chat? Oh, thanks, Dan. Okay, well, we are here though too, so we will provide our contact details as well. So if you have any further questions moving forward, please feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to answer your questions. We might just move on to feedback as well, just before we finish up. So as I mentioned at the start, this session and the Understanding Farm Carbon workshops are all funded by the government. So we do have to report on feedback as part of that funding as well, unfortunately. So if we could just take a couple of minutes to quickly provide some feedback from today's webinar, that would be fantastic. So I'll just give you guys a couple of minutes to do that before we close out today's session. Yes, Vicky, I just saw your comment there in the chat. There are South Australia workshops happening, and from what I understand, very soon. Is that right, Scott?
Yeah, that's right. So first South Australia workshop will be actually next week on the 10th of April in Mount Compass. We will have a second workshop in Mount Gambier in early FY26, just working on those dates at the moment. But I can include, or if someone's got more screens than me that can find the right link to that one and would like to drop a link in the chat.
I can chase that, Scott.
Fantastic. Thanks, Heidi.
Thanks, Heidi. So we might move on to what's next and close for the webinar. So what's next? Well, we have a number of on-farm days coming up where we'll be deep diving into a particular carbon farming activity. These will likely be dependent on farmer suggestions at workshops as well. We have a number of workshops and one-on-ones that'll be happening throughout the year as well. We would love your support in encouraging farmers to attend our upcoming workshops. We have many scheduled in your region across Australia. You can find these on the Dairy Australia calendar. As I mentioned earlier, this funding is only until March 2026. So the more farmers we have completing the workshops and receiving support to complete the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator now, the easier it will be for the dairy industry moving forward. When the funding finishes next year, though, Dairy Australia will continue to provide industry support through our industry emissions roadmap. Also, if one of your suppliers has attended a workshop and would like support completing the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, you are welcome to attend as well, provided your supplier has given the okay to do so as well. And lastly, we're here to help, so please get in touch, come to a workshop or come along to a one-on-one. Thank you for joining our webinar today.